County Council of Devon employs 17,000 civil servants. The Indian civil service, towards the end of the 19th century, employed fewer than 1,000 men to run the government of 300 million inhabitants. In a meeting with the German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, Joseph Stalin said,
"It is ridiculous that a few hundred Englishmen should dominate India."
In charge of those few hundred men was an elite of 16 or 17 civil servants who ran the jewel in the crown. Once a year, in stiff collars and heavy outfits, and probably in stifling heat, the secretaries of the government departments and members of the Viceregal Council of India assembled for their group photograph. The year was 1889. Third from the left in the back row is my great-grandfather, Stephen Harvey-James. Stephen Harvey-James was born in Cornwall in 1849. He was the son of a Stephen Harvey-James and the grandson of a Stephen Harvey-James, both proprietors of Botallic tin and copper mines near St Justin Penwith. From Shrewsbury School, seen here in sixth form splendour, he went on to sit the highly competitive Indian Civil Service exams of 1870. My mother told the story in her autobiography.
My grandfather, Stephen Harvey-James III, always known as Harvey, was the second son of that large family. He must have been brilliantly clever. My grandmother, whom he was courting at the time, declared that she would marry him only if he passed first in the Indian Civil Service entrance exam of 1870. So he did, and moreover won all the 3 prizes of £50 each, offered for the highest proficiency in Indian history and geography and in the Hindi and Persian languages.
Coming top in the examination meant that his name was forever first in the civil service list for the entry of 1870. He progressed through the service, becoming an assistant magistrate in the northwestern provinces, a magistrate in Peshawar, registrar of the High Court of the northwestern provinces, and finally, secretary of the Legislative Department of India, in effect, Attorney General. The great classical scholar Benjamin Jowett, master of Balliol College, Oxford, said,
"Men who want to do a great and permanent good should go to India."
He told a former pupil, who became the law member of the Viceroy's Council, that he had one of the most desirable positions in the world. The Secretary of the Legislative Department was, ex officio, also the Secretary to the Government of India. Legislation and the minutes of the Viceregal Council were signed by him. His salary was in excess of £3,500 a year, a very comfortable income at that time, and his standard of living must have been a good one. An extract from the ICS Book of Regulations states,
"An ordinary member of the Governor-General's Council, when travelling on duty by railway, is entitled to a reserved first-class carriage, together with such accommodation not exceeding one compartment of a third-class carriage, as he considers needful for his personal servants."
The job carried an almost automatic knighthood, and he was probably destined for even greater things. But he died at the age of 48, possibly as the result of alcoholism.
Poor ambitious granny, she had set her heart on becoming a knight's lady. That had seemed a certainty, and now she had to return to England untitled and a widow living on a pension, for grandfather had not been provident.
So who was with my great-grandfather in the photo? These middle-aged, middle and upper-class British and Irish men were the government of India, all India, including what are now Pakistan, Bangladesh and Burma. There are 10 knights of the realm, a field marshal, 4 other generals, 4 lords and 2 holders of the Victoria Cross. Starting top left is Sir Edward Buck, Administrator of the Department of Agriculture. The job title sounds rather dry, but he was a lively and amusing writer. There is on record a story about him and the unmasking of a sort of Uri Geller of her day, Madame Blavatsky, one of the founders of Theosophy. Using a conjuring trick, she claimed that mystical powers enabled her to, amongst other things, cause a plant to grow from a seed in minutes. Here is a portion of their dialogue during a soiree at Rothney House in Shimla.
Now, sir, I will show you one thing that shall convince you. You have something to do with agriculture?
Yes, I have the honour to administer the Department of Agriculture.
Well, sir, you shall plant a seed and it shall grow in 6 months. I shall plant that seed and that shall grow in 6 minutes.
Madame, I pray you spare yourself that trouble. No doubt you can do as you say, but I, in my ignorant scepticism, should only believe it to be the mango trick of the Madras conjurers.
What, sir? You class me with those vulgar impostors? You call yourself gentleman? You come here, sir, to insult me. You call me cheat? How dare you?
Before leaving, I should wish to make one suggestion to Madame Blavatsky. Will she permit me to go to the Viceroy tomorrow and ask His Excellency to transfer the Agricultural Department from my charge to hers? For that department was recently created to deal with the protection of the country against famine. And if Madame Blavatsky can raise crops in 6 minutes, what more is wanted? Good night.
At university by the age of 15, Patrick McDonald became a very distinguished civil servant and politician. At the time of the photograph, he was Home Secretary to the Indian Central Government. It may surprise some to learn that MacDonald was an Irishman and a Catholic, and that after his Indian career, he was the man chosen to become the administrative head of the Irish government in 1902. He was an opponent of partition. Had the policies he favoured succeeded, much of the Irish troubles might have been avoided. While he was in India, MacDonald's policies on the management of famine conditions are credited with having saved millions of lives. To dismiss these men as wicked colonialists would be a knee-jerk reaction. They were not profiteers. They were salaried employees working far from home in unfamiliar territory and weather. Their first home leave came after 8 years in India. Today's politicians could learn a lot from the immaculate conduct of these men. John Strachey, the Labour Minister, judged it
the least corruptible and most respectable of all the great bureaucracies of the world.
In The Ruling Caste, David Gilmour says,
The Indian civil service may have had its critics, but about its elevated standards there was no argument. N.B. Banerjee, a member of the service but also an Indian nationalist, praised
its rectitude, its sense of justice, its tolerance, its sense of public duty, its high administrative ability.
The government of India had strict views about the financial transactions of its officials. Not only did civilians have to be incorruptible, they had to be above suspicion. They were not allowed any interest, however innocent, in any commercial venture that might affect their professional conduct. If you were the chief secretary in Madras, your son could not own a coffee plantation in the presidency. If you were the political agent in a native state, your relations could not buy property there.
On the other side of Stephen Harvey-James is the dashing Lord William de la Poer Beresford, Victoria Cross, military private secretary to the Viceroy. From David Gilmour's Ruling Caste, again.
His future nemesis was the subject of much speculation. Observers in Shimla wondering whether he would break his neck with his reckless steeplechasing before he was cited as co-respondent in a divorce case.
Next is the remarkably named George Washington Brazier Cray, aide-de-camp to the Viceroy. ADCs were highly glamorous figures for the British young ladies in India. Sir Edward Buck, whom we have already seen in the picture, tells this little story in Shimla, Past and Present. One day a pretty young thing came to church with her mother. On the way home, she was heard gushing,
"Oh, Mother, wasn't it a wonderful service?"
Why, wonderful, dear. It seemed to me just as usual.
replied her mother.
Mother, didn't you notice? There were 5 ADCs.
Gloria, Gloria,
Looking more like a romantic poet than a major general, John Ardagh, an Irishman, was typical of these dynamic, get-on-with-it men. Today, Newhaven in Sussex welcomes ships from France. In 1860, the threat of a French invasion was considered so serious that the government commissioned the building of a huge fort to defend Newhaven harbour. The man who designed the fort and supervised its construction was only 22 years old, a lieutenant in the Royal Engineers, John Ardagh. With a workforce of 250 men, dozens of horses and 3 steam engines, Ardagh took an original approach to this massive task. Instead of flattening the building site, Ardagh's design made the fort blend with the existing landscape. At the time of the group photograph, he was private secretary to the Viceroy. Later in his splendid career, he was to become a full general and the government director of the Suez Canal Company. Next along is another major general, Sir Edwin Colin. He was one of the new breed of generals who had earned their promotion through merit. Some of the older officers, still in the army at that time, had bought their commissions and early promotions. The purchase of commissions was abolished in 1871. But the older officers here could have started their military careers in that way. In The Pirates of Penzance, first performed 10 years earlier in 1879, Gilbert and Sullivan satirized the new type of general, suggesting that, while these officers might be very learned, they knew little about warfare.
In fact, when I know what is meant by Babylon and Rabbit, when I can tell at sight a Mauser rifle from a javelin, when such affairs as sorties and surprises I'm all bad at, and when I know precisely what is meant by commissariat, when I have learned what progress has been made in modern gunnery, when I know more of tactics than a novice in anatomy, in short, when I was smattering of elemental strategy. Strategy. I have it! You say it, Major General.
In 1889, Lord Roberts was Commander-in-Chief of the Army in India. In his lifetime, from 1832 to 1914, he received so many titles and decorations that there was barely room for them all on his fairly small chest. He was, eventually, Field Marshal the Right Honourable the Earl Roberts, Victoria Cross, Knight of the Garter, Knight of St. Patrick, Knight Grand Cross Commander of the Bath, Order of Merit, Knight Grand Cross of the Star of India, Knight Grand Cross of the Indian Empire. Roberts' feats on the Empire's battlefields, such as the relief of Lucknow, earned him an almost godlike status. He was often called the Pocket Wellington, although Roberts shared none of that general's disdain for the common soldier.
On the 2nd of January 1858 at Kuragani, on following up the retreating enemy, he saw in the distance 2 sepoys going away with the standard. He immediately gave chase and took possession of the standard, cutting down the man who was carrying it. On the same day, he saved the life of a...
British soldiers were in Afghanistan then. Roberts led 10,000 soldiers to achieve the capture of Kabul and the relief of Kandahar. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem in his praise, using the general's nickname, Bobs.
There's a little red-faced man, which is Bobs, rides the tallest horse he can, our Bobs. If it bucks or kicks or rears, he can sit for 20 years with a smile round both his ears, can't you, Bobs? If you stood him on his head, Father Bobs, you could spill a quart of lead out of Bobs. He's been at it 30 years and amassing souvenirs in the way of slugs or spears, ain't you, Bobs?
William McGonagall had a go as well.
Success to Lord Roberts, he's a very brave man, for he conquered the Afghans in Afghanistan. With an army about 7,000 strong, he spread death and desolation all along.
Most of the men in the group came from middle-class backgrounds, but the top job, Viceroy, nearly always went to an aristocrat. Perhaps there were limits as to how far you could trust the middle classes. The man on the throne is the 5th Marquis of Lansdowne. Immediately after Eton and Oxford, at the age of 21, Henry Petty Fitzmaurice inherited the title and, along with it, massive wealth and vast properties in Ireland and England, including Bowood House in Wiltshire and Lansdowne House in Berkeley Square. He immediately became very active in the House of Lords, serving eventually in Gladstone's Liberal government as Under-Secretary of State for War. In 1883, at the age of 38, he was appointed Governor-General of Canada, and after 5 years in Canada, he was appointed to the Jewel in the Crown, Viceroy of India. The name Viceroy means in the place of the monarch. Look closely and you can see that Lansdowne's private secretary, Lord William, has his hand resting rather casually on the back of the Viceroy's throne. But Lord William was a holder of the Victoria Cross, so maybe he was allowed to do that, or maybe it was because Lord William's father was also a Marquis. I like to think that, if Lord Lansdowne had known about this lèse-majesté, he would have said out of the corner of his mouth, "Get your hand off my chair." They were all members of a distinguished and impressive bunch, but we shall skip to the last man in the line, Sir David Barber, Secretary to the Department of Finance. His books on monetary matters are on the syllabus of university courses to this day, including one with the uncatchy title of The Theory of Bimetallism and the Effects of the Partial Demonetization of Silver on England and India. That may well have been the book that Oscar Wilde had in mind in The Importance of Being Earnest, when he gave Miss Prism this line.
Cecily, you will read your political economy in my absence. The chapter on the fall of the rupee you may omit. It is somewhat too exciting for a young girl.